This is Module 3 of the new Private Pesticide Applicator training. We're going to be covering applicator safety in this module. So first, we want to discuss the different categories of toxicity that we see in pesticides. So toxicity is the potential harmful effect of a pesticide. When we talk about chronic toxicity, we're referring to harmful effects that develop over a repeated period of exposures, potentially years. Cancers, tumors, nervous system, and developmental disorders and damage to internal organs are some examples of serious chronic exposure effects. An allergic response is a type of response that only some people may develop. Allergic responses are the unique response of an individual's immune system. Responses vary widely and may include skin rashes, eye watering, itching, and more serious and even life-threatening responses such as difficulty breathing. Response may be delayed. It may take one or more exposures to the material before an allergic response occurs. In contrast, acute toxicity may appear immediately upon exposure or within a short period of time, such as 24 to 48 hours. This type of acute toxicity will be our focus today. So, acute toxicity is categorized into 4 categories. The short-term effects, 24 to 48 hours. And this kind of toxicity will have a signal word on the label that indicates its acute toxicity category. And this is your guide to how toxic the pesticide is. So the signal word is the word on the label that corresponds with 4 acute toxicity categories. And you see those here. The danger category corresponds with category 1, or highly toxic pesticides. Warning is for moderately toxic, or category 2. The caution is category 3 or 4, which is slightly toxic or practically non-toxic. And so manufacturers are not required to put a signal word on the label for products the EPA has classified as category 4, the practically non-toxic category. So for danger pesticides, here is an example of a pesticide label showing the signal word. In this case, the signal word is danger, meaning the material is highly toxic and appears with the word poison and the skull and crossbones symbol as seen here. With poison, skull and crossbones, the word danger indicates that the pesticide is highly toxic by oral, dermal, and inhalation exposures. If the word danger appeared without this skull and crossbones, this would mean that the material is severely corrosive to the eyes or skin. What really determines this kind of the risk that a pesticide applicator has? Well, it's really a combination of the toxicity of the pesticide and the exposure that the applicator has. Exposure means how much, how long, or how often you are exposed to the pesticide and where on your body you've been exposed. Repeated longer exposures lead to more risk. So this equation, risk equals toxicity times exposure, really ties it all together. The toxicity and exposure are equally important. So now we'll discuss how to reduce your risk to exposure. Mainly, this is by wearing personal protective equipment. Always wear personal protective equipment required by the pesticide label. This is your best and most important line of defense. When the EPA decides to register a pesticide in the United States, this means that they have weighed the risks against the potential benefits of using the product. Products are only registered when the pesticide label can be written in such a way that will protect the user from excessive risk. But if you fail to wear the PPE, all bets are off. You might be exposing yourself to excessive risk. Even if you do most of your spraying from the comfort of an air-conditioned cab, make sure you keep a full set of PPE on hand in case you exit the cab in the middle of a sprayed field to check the boom or nozzles. Otherwise, you will be exposing yourself to the pesticides. So there are different routes of entry that a pesticide may have. There are 4 main ways that it can enter the body. We'll look at each of these in turn. First is dermally. This is through the skin. This is the most common route of exposure to pesticides. At the minimum, all agricultural pesticides will require you to wear a long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, and socks to prevent dermal exposure. And depending on the pesticide, additional equipment may be required. Dermal exposure is the most common way that pesticides get to the body. Skin exposure may consist of contact chemical exposure, which irritates the skin. Some pesticides are also capable of penetrating the skin, and once inside the body may be able to travel in the bloodstream. Oil-soluble active ingredients have the ability to penetrate the skin and pose a higher exposure risk. Most pesticides will also require chemical-resistant gloves. Regardless of whether gloves are required or not, you should always wear gloves when applying pesticides. Many studies have shown that gloves dramatically reduce the amount of pesticide exposure because obviously you can't apply pesticides without using your hands. Similarly, chemical-resistant boots are also much preferred to wearing leather shoes or boots, even if not required by the label. All gloves are not alike, and labels may distinguish between types of gloves. Some pesticides may allow chemical-resistant gloves of any waterproof material, while others may specify a specific type of chemical-resistant gloves, such as butyl or nitrile rubber, more than or equal to 14 milliliters. Beware that the medical exam gloves from drugstores are not suitable for pesticide application. A sturdy pair of nitrile gloves, as seen here in this picture, 14 mils, is a good choice for gloves when the type is not specified. Also, don't tuck your long sleeves into the gloves. If you spill a chemical on yourself, it will roll down into the glove. Depending on the pesticide, you may also be required to wear some or all of the chemical-resistant PPE shown here. Depending on the task you are performing, there may be different PPE. For example, a chemical-resistant apron, as shown here, may be required for mixing and loading. This protects your torso, especially from spills of concentrated chemicals that might occur during mixing and loading. Don't forget, when you repair sprayers or change out nozzles, you're also being exposed to pesticides. Wear gloves. A tight-fitting disposable nitrile glove works well for this purpose. So be sure to read the pesticide PPE statement carefully. You may be required to wear different PPE for different tasks. Handling a concentrate when mixing may require more PPE than spraying a dilute concentration. Liberty is an example of a farm chemical that requires a chemical-resistant apron for mixing, but not during spray application of the diluted concentrate. The formulation of a pesticide can also affect your dermal exposure. You're more at risk of dermal exposure using pesticides that are oil soluble and have petroleum distillates as the carrier. The skin is a good barrier to water-soluble substances, but oil-soluble substances move easily across the skin and into your bloodstream. The emulsifiable concentrate, or ECs, fall into this category. They have a high concentration of active ingredient and may require more PPE. This slide shows the different rates of absorption through the skin. and how it can vary greatly depending on the area of the skin. This is because different parts of the body have thicker or thinner skin, and where the blood vessels are closer to the skin, this leads to greater absorption. Also, if you're hot and sweaty, you absorb more pesticide than if you are cool and dry. Think about what happens if you take a break and use the restroom after applying pesticides by looking at how much exposure you have through your hands. Make sure you wash your hands after applying pesticides and before visiting the restroom. Just to note, these figures came from a real study in which very small amounts of methylparathion were placed on different parts of the body. This slide depicts types of clothing that can be worse than wearing nothing at all. Cotton gloves, hats, and leather can all absorb pesticides and hold them close to your skin. Also, a pesticide cannot easily be removed from these materials. Many farmers wear leather boots. It's far better to keep a pair of water-resistant boots for spraying and not contaminate the boots that you wear in the home. Cotton gloves should never be worn when applying pesticides, with the exception of fumigants. A cotton hat should not be worn if spraying overhead. The spray can filter down on you. Instead, a chemical-resistant head covering should be worn. So the next type of exposure is ocular, which is through your eyes. Pesticides that are corrosive may require eye protection. Splashes in the eye are more likely to occur during mixing and loading. With some pesticides, only those activities may require eye protection. Other pesticides may require it for any task. Eye sensitivity depends on the pesticides and can range from minor irritation and watering to severe burning and permanent eye injury. Choose eye protection that offers protection from splash and is not vented along the sides. Warrior is an example of a pesticide that requires eye protection. The next route of entry is inhalation. Respirators provide protection from inhalation exposure. While most agricultural chemicals do not require respirators, there are some key products that farmers use that require them. For example, gramoxone, dicofol, lorbspan, and Ingenia are all pesticides that require respirators for certain tasks. Clean the respirator after each use to keep sanitary and remove pesticide residues. Greenhouse, nursery, Christmas tree, and orchard growers also may commonly use some materials that require a respirator. Be certain that restricted entry intervals have expired before workers return and for enclosed areas for any ventilation requirements. If a respirator is required, there are specific greenhouse ventilation requirements under the worker protection standard. So some more on respirators. The worker protection standard requires growers to have an initial medical evaluation and annual fit test when using pesticides that require a respirator. You're required to do this for yourself, not just employees, if you are using the pesticide with WPS labeling. With a respirator requirement for any kind of agricultural production. There's no such thing as a small farm or family exemption. So it's important to use and maintain your PPE correctly. Proper use and care of a respirator involves performing a seal check prior to each use. Seal checks indicate whether you're getting a seal around the edges and may reveal if the mask has been damaged or cracked. You should use the respirator correctly according to the manufacturer's instructions. Unless the manufacturer provides different instructions, be sure to change out the cartridges with every 8 hours of cumulative use. After each use, clean the respirator to keep it sanitary and remove chemical residues. Disposable cloths for this purpose are useful. Respirators should be stored in a clean plastic bag, away from chemicals, not like the picture shown here. It's stored with other chemicals. And in this example, the cartridge can absorb the chemicals that are in the area. Proper use and care applies to all types of PPE, whether it's a respirator or a pair of gloves. Look for cracks and worn areas, and if you find them, discard them and obtain new ones. So to prevent oral exposure or exposure through ingestion, you want to avoid doing something like this. Oral exposure can cause coughing, irritation, or swelling of the nose and throat. And with some pesticides, it's much more serious and can cause poisoning symptoms. Very poisonous episodes and deaths have occurred from accidental ingestion because pesticides were stored in food or drink containers. Pesticides should never be placed in food containers. Accidental ingestion may also occur if PPE is not worn and common sense is lacking. For example, what's wrong with this picture? This applicator is smoking while making an application. Pesticide residues on his hands will be transferred to the cigarette, then ingested when the cigarette's placed in his mouth. Often, oral exposure with pesticides is through accidental ingestion of residue that may be on your hands. The good workplace hygiene can prevent this. Wash your hands before smoking, eating, using the phone, or the restroom. Also, when you're done applying, make sure to wash your hands thoroughly. So now we're going to cover how to remove your PPE when you're done applying to avoid self-contamination. First, you want to leave your gloves on and wash the exterior of the gloves with water and detergent. Next, wash the exterior of any other PPE you may have on and then remove them. The final step is once again to wash your gloves before removing them. Don't fail to actually wash your PPE. Wearing it over and over again without cleaning will lead to buildup of pesticide residues that you could inadvertently expose yourself to every time you use the equipment. By going through these steps, you will greatly reduce your pesticide exposure. After spraying pesticides, avoid taking the residues into your home with you. If possible, shower and change before returning home. If not, at least remove your contaminated clothing, especially the boots. Shower and change into fresh clothing as soon as you return home. Make sure to launder any clothing with pesticide residues separately from the family wash using detergent and hot water. Run an additional wash cycle after washing pesticide-contaminated clothes to remove any residues from your washer. Recent research suggests that newer high-efficiency washers do a reasonably good job of removing pesticides from clothes, as do traditional agitation washers. It's wise to be able to recognize any symptoms of pesticide poisoning. This is a list of some of the more serious side effects of pesticide exposure. Although not all pesticides will cause these symptoms. Headaches, dizziness, nausea, sweating, and chills. These symptoms can mimic the flu. Chest pains, breathing difficulty, these could mimic a heart attack. So the bottom line is, if you've been applying pesticide, then experiencing some of these serious symptoms seek help immediately. Pesticide poisoning is a distinct possibility. Be sure to take the label of the pesticide with you when you see your doctor. So now to cover some first aid for pesticide poisoning. The first thing to do when possible is to remove the victim from the site where they're exposed. For example, if they've inhaled a pesticide, make sure to get them some fresh air. Be sure to protect yourself from being exposed while you're helping another. If they are experiencing serious symptoms, like the ones on the previous slide, call for emergency help or get the person to the nearest medical facility. While waiting for help, read and follow the first aid instructions on the label. For accidental poisoning by ingestion, always read the pesticide label before taking any action. The most critical decision is whether to induce vomiting. It depends on the pesticide if this should be done. Make sure to take the label with you to the doctor. Heat stress is a potential side effect of applying pesticides, especially if the conditions are hot, humid, and much PPE is required. In this situation, the body overheats and can't cool itself sufficiently. When the core body temperature rises, heat stress can develop into heat stroke, which is life-threatening. The symptoms of heat stress are shown on this slide. Apply pesticides in the cooler part of the day, take frequent breaks, and stay hydrated to help prevent heat stress. The first aid for heat stress would be to move the victim to a cool area. Remove excessive clothing, splash with cool water. If the victim is conscious, provide them with cool water to drink. And then you would want to call for emergency help. So this ends Module 3. Now you can take the quiz included in this module, as well as the quiz in the bulletin to review your knowledge of this material.